who have worked to pull this together in very record time, taking advantage of the fact that David Smolansky can be with us only this week, and if not then till August. And this is, I think, too important and timely a topic to delay. As many of you know, the Venezuelan refugee crisis is the third largest in the world. There are alarming new figures that have been released in June by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees that demonstrate, once again, that a staggering 4 million Venezuelans have left their homeland, the vast majority since 2015. I mean, this is a very short period of time. This constitutes something like 12 to 13% of Venezuela's total population. 1 million Venezuelans have migrated in just a seven-month period ending last May. They are leaving behind a collapsed economy and mounting repression. The United Nations projects that by the end of this year, the number of refugees outside Venezuela will climb to 5.4 million from a point of 4 million now, and others, such as Dani Bahar, who's with us today, predict that that number will be higher by several hundred thousand. These numbers will continue to rise as long as the intertwined political, economic, and humanitarian crises in Venezuela continue unabated. There is now a new report by the Organization of American States, presented just now at its General Assembly a few weeks ago, that indicates that the Venezuelan refugee crisis trails only that of Syria and Afghanistan and is nearly quadruple the number of Rohingya, also something that concerns us deeply. All of that said, international assistance for Venezuelan refugees is only a fraction of the amount devoted to other major crises. Last year, the UNHCR and the International Organization of Migration, through its joint platform, asked the international community in 2019 alone to provide $738 million for the countries of the region that are receiving Venezuelan migrants. By June, however, donors, international donors, had contributed only 21% of that amount. And I'm proud to say, as a citizen of the United States, that 75% of the funds that were donated came from the U.S. government. This, in the words of an aid worker that we interviewed in Bogota as part of a congressional staff delegation several weeks ago, constitutes nothing less than a recipe for disaster. There are a number of frameworks in which we can understand the crisis of Venezuelan refugees, from the rights of refugees themselves under a variety of international and regional agreements and conventions, but also in terms of meeting the needs of migrant-receiving countries themselves. The nations of Latin America and the Caribbean have been enormously generous, but the flows, in my view, are unsustainable, and it is only a matter of time until they spark a major backlash. We are very privileged to have with us today experts from Venezuela, from the international community, who are on the front lines of delivering assistance to Venezuelan refugees and to advocating for a robust response from donor countries. So I would like to thank them in advance for the tremendous work that they are doing on the ground, and also for documenting the needs and trends around this human tragedy. I'll introduce, you have bios, and so I'll only introduce our speakers briefly. First, we will hear from David Smolansky, who is the coordinator for the Venezuelan migration and refugee crisis in the region at the Organization of American States. He is the former mayor from 2013 to 2017 of El Hatillo municipality of Caracas. And prior to his time as mayor of El Hatillo, he served as deputy secretary general of Voluntad Popular, an opposition political party, well known to most of us, of which he is a co-founder. David will be followed by Matt Reynolds, who is the regional representative for the United States and the Caribbean of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. He has also served in other senior positions in the UN, including the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, has also held a number of senior positions in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. State Department. Next, we'll hear from Dani Bahar, who is the David Rubenstein Fellow in Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institution. He is an Israeli and Venezuelan economist. He's also an associate at the Harvard Center for International Development. And as we all know, because we follow his work, he's the author of numerous studies on Venezuelan refugees and the Venezuelan economy that have become essential points of reference. Finally, we will hear virtually from Christian Wiesnes, who is the country director in Colombia of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Christian is going to be joining us virtually, and he has led the response in Colombia, the country on the border of Venezuela that has received the largest number of migrants, 1.3 million. Prior to that, he was the regional representative in Latin America of the Norwegian Red Cross. He has decades of experience in the humanitarian sector, serving with a number of United Nations agencies. So with those brief introductory words, I'd like to now turn the microphone over to David Smolansky, and thank you again for joining us on this rather steamy July morning in Washington.
Cynthia, thank you so much, Cynthia, for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Wilson Center, for having us. 2 weeks ago, on the context of the General Assembly of the Organization of American States, which is the most important annual event of this organization, we presented our report on the crisis of the migrants and migration and refugee crisis of Venezuela. A report that was done with different independent experts, one of them Mr. Dani Bahar. And I just want to share with you some of the aspects that we found on this report. First, as Cynthia was saying, there are 4 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees at the moment. This is the biggest refugee crisis in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, and right now it's the second in the world, just behind Syria. Why 4 million Venezuelans have fled against their will? We have found 5 determinants. The first is the humanitarian crisis, focused on lack of food and lack of medicine. 1/3 of the population in Venezuela at the moment need humanitarian assistance, as the United Nations said weeks ago. Our 88% of the medicine in Venezuela are now you don't find it, or you don't find it frequently. The other determinant is the generalized violence. Venezuela is still one of the most violent countries in the world, with a homicide rate of 81 persons per 100,000 people. And we have municipalities in Venezuela which the homicide rate could go even to 600 per 100,000 people. So in the last 5 years, more than 130,000 Venezuelans have been killed because of crime. So still, violence is one of the determinants that people decide to go. Third, the human rights violation. Since 2014 until today, just to give you an example, more than 15,000 people have been illegally detained, not mentioning people that have been even killed because of tortures, of thousands that have been persecuted or have been victims of repression. Also, with the human rights violation, the social control that have been implemented by the regime through the what we call in Spanish, carnet de la patria, which is basically a parallel ID of your national identity, that if you get that, but in some moment you participate in a protest, or you post a story in Facebook, or you just tweet something against the regime, you could be victim of a persecution. And at the end of the day, the regime is controlling what you eat, where do you live, or which medicine you can find. The fourth determinant is the a collapse of the economy, specifically focused on a hyperinflation that ended last year in more than 1,300,000%, and this year is projected more than 10 million% according to the IMF. So it doesn't matter if you work in Venezuela, money is worthless. And the fifth, which is something that especially we saw in the last 3 months, is the collapse of the basic services, specifically electricity and water. And this is something that we didn't find last year, but in our visits during the last months in Peru, Ecuador, in Colombia, and I'm not exaggerating that every 10 Venezuelans I was able to interview, 6 told me that they decided to leave after the apagón, the power outage that happened on March 7. So people felt so afraid to not have electricity. The water lacks a lot in Venezuela, so they decided, a lot of people decided to leave after that. So with those 5 determinants, our main proposal in the report is that Venezuelans should be given the status of refugee. And we're arguing this through the Cartagena Declaration of 1984. The Cartagena Declaration expands the concept of refugee and says that a refugee is someone that flees its country because of generalized violence, human rights violation, or alteration of the public order. In our opinion, those aspects today are very clear to Venezuelans, and that is why they are leaving. So, if you give refugee status to the Venezuelans that have fled the country, you will guarantee protection. And of course, this is not only that has to be implemented by 1 or 2 countries. The Cartagena Declaration that we are proposing in this case to give Venezuelan refugee status has to be a regional implementation. We're trying to get with this report a huge discussion to get the consensus of the region to give Venezuelans a refugee status. In some numbers, and I'll stop it there to listen to my other colleagues. On those 4 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, 67% are in 4 countries. Colombia, 1.3 million, Peru, 850,000, Chile, 290,000, and Ecuador, 300,000. So in those 4 countries, there are 2.7 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees out of the 4 million. So 67% of the Venezuelan migrants and refugees are in those 4 countries. Those are absolute numbers. But if you go to relative numbers, I always say this, Curaçao and Aruba have the highest Venezuelan migrants and refugees in the region. 15% of the population of Aruba and 15% of the population of Curaçao is Venezuelan at the moment. 26,000 Venezuelans live in Curaçao out of 160,000, and 16,000 Venezuelans are in Aruba out of 110,000. So it is important when we talk about numbers, not only interpret those numbers on absolute terms, but also on relative terms. And also, it's important to know that behind those 4 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees is something beyond numbers. There are shattering stories there that why people have fled the country, families that have been separated, so many challenges when they have to flee the country. We found that 101 people at least have died the last year trying to escape Venezuela. Boats that have sunk, accidents that are happening in Rio Táchira River that separates Colombia and Venezuela. And unfortunately, in our opinion, if this situation continues in Venezuela, when I say this situation, the humanitarian crisis, the generalized violence, the human rights violation, the lack of electricity and water, if this situation continues in Venezuela, we could be talking of more than 5 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees by the end of the year. But what is worst is that in 2020, we could be even higher than Syria. So the faster Venezuela restore its democracy is not only better for Venezuela, but it's better for the region. And I think as a coordinator of this working group, of this responsibility the Secretary General has given me, I mean, the best solution for this crisis is to restore democracy and freedom in Venezuela. Migration flow will decrease, and at least it will be an incentive for people that have fled to go back. This has happened with no natural catastrophe and no war in a bit more than 4 years. So it's no precedent in the region.
Thank you very much. Matt?
Great.
That's not
Let's use this one. And thank you very much to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this today. It's particularly important to bring attention to this very large and evolving crisis. As was pointed out, you know, it's even for our 2019 Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan is only 23% funded. So, so thank you for 23 as of July 1st. So I'd like to thank you for bringing this issue to everyone's attention. And of course, I'd also like to just point out that it's actually my colleagues in the field who are really doing the hard work. I'm sort of here taking some credit and giving you some information. But in reality, UNHCR, colleagues in the field in Colombia and all over the region are doing all the hard work. You know, this is a unique and different kind of situation compared to our standard refugee crises in other places, say the Rohingya in Bangladesh. So, so the Secretary General of the United States of the United Nations created a special platform to address this situation. This is a joint platform of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which is the UN Migration Agency. In fact, because this is indeed a mixed flow, it started primarily as a migratory action, and now today is primarily a refugee type of action. And so therefore we've created this interesting new platform. It's sort of the first for the UN, again, looking at this different mixed evolving situation. As David pointed out, you know, the impact is unprecedented in this region. You know, there are more than 4 million refugees and migrants. 1.8 million have a legal stay arrangement, and we can discuss later what those entail. About 618,000 or more are asylum seekers and recognized refugees. A significant percentage, though, of the rest are in the irregular situation. We have about 5,000 per day coming out, leaving Venezuela. In addition, remember, there's a cross-border, what I call a circular movement that happens of about 3.1 million Venezuelans, primarily in Colombia, who cross back and forth and round between the two countries. And there are also significant returns from Venezuela of others. Recall that Venezuela was a very generous host to tens of thousands, to all kinds of millions of Colombian refugees and others historically over the years. There's also a large Guyanese population that actually works in Venezuela, which is now returning to Guyana. So the impact, as I said, is quite large and quite historic. I know some of my thunder was stolen. Part of my jurisdiction is the Caribbean, and David is right. With Curacao, with over 16%, we're looking of being Venezuelan there. I just want to put this in perspective to us here today, okay? We're sitting here in Washington, D.C. There are 702,000 people in this city. Add 100,000, just add the 100,000, and there you've got Curacao. So the impact is indeed quite harsh, particularly on the smaller islands, Aruba, Curacao, and Trinidad and Tobago. I think the other I think where and how this crisis is kind of different for the modern world is we're actually being able to use a lot of the concepts and things that were in the Global Compact on Refugees and others, because how this is being addressed is through many different forms. We have the UN form, which is now the platform of UNHCR IOM. In reality, we're just a Band-Aid to the crisis, as we always are as humanitarian first responders. And what we need is leadership in the stitching and the healing process, which is much more of a political aspect that we do not deal with. But we also have the involvement now of the World Bank, as you've seen, the same way they have been involved in Jordan and Lebanon, moving in that direction, providing assistance to countries and to host communities. And of course, the whole Quito 4 process, which is, again, exploring all kinds of alternative pathways, local solutions, in the interim. So this continues to evolve, and we continue to adapt with sort of newer concepts and newer ways. But again, I appreciate the attention because it is very underfunded. It is very, I don't want to say ignored, but it is not on the headlines. But part of that is that the whole global humanitarian area is just overwhelmed. We just did our global trends report on 2018, and we have the highest number of refugees. There are more and more refugee crises of large size and of protraction. You know, we think of even like the Rohingya, which just was in our minds from last year, but that crisis really started in 1992. It's a 26-year-old refugee crisis. So, and then we add this new challenge on top of it, and it is hard to get the attention of the world community. It's hard to get the resources because it is stretched so very thin. Thank you.
Should I go ahead? Okay. Thank you so much, Cynthia, and the Wilson Center for having us, and everybody for coming today to discuss this really, really important topic. So just, I want to say a few things. I'm an economist, so I ask you, yeah, exactly, so apologies for that. So I am going to actually tell you a little bit of some numbers and some ideas in that sense. I think that in the big scheme of things, it is important to recognize that the region so far has shown a lot of generosity with Venezuelans. Probably generosity that we haven't seen in other types of crises. I mean, the one that of course comes to mind is the reaction of Europe to the Syrian refugee crisis. I think that in general, most countries in the region are welcoming and are trying to do their best to deal with this crisis that they never imagined. Some of these countries, or most of these countries, don't even have legislation to deal with migration, because the country in the region that was de facto the one receiving migrants historically was Venezuela. In fact, Venezuela was one of the pioneering founders of UNHCR in 1945 when Rómulo Betancourt became president. They went actually to Europe to find and get refugees from World War II, including my grandparents, by the way. So I think it's important to put that in context. What we're seeing now in some areas is that there are some attempts to, quote unquote, regulate migration by some countries in the region by imposing new visas or other kind of restrictions. It's not clear, or at least it's not fully explicit, what's the reasoning behind doing this regulation. We all know that these, I say quote unquote regulation because they are actually restrictions, because we know that Venezuelans, for the most part, really struggle to even get a passport, right? There's no paper to print passports in Venezuela. There's a black market for passports. If you want to get a passport, you could pay more than $1,000, which it's several years of minimum wages in Venezuela. So once you put a visa as a restriction, you're basically implying this person cannot get in, or at least cannot get in through the legal or formal ways. The flows are going to keep going on, even if they're in irregular ways. But I think that one of the reasoning for several governments to impose this restriction, for the most part, is the economics of it. I think that there's a very strong rhetoric that usually don't come from that their rhetoric doesn't come from economists that say that migrants are, you know, taking over the jobs and lowering wages and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let me tell you something you've heard, but I'm going to say it again. There's no evidence whatsoever, or there's the evidence that it's heavily supports the fact that that doesn't happen. Migrants don't take jobs of natives. Migrants don't depress wages of the wages of natives or create unemployment. We're talking here about numbers that are really big in the Caribbean. In countries like Colombia, we're talking about 1 or 2% of the population, which is probably the highest in the region in terms of percentage. Well, let me tell you something. There's a case of Israel, which I know well, who received 20% of its population, increased 20% of the population in the early 1990s, people from the Soviet Union, and there was no depression of wages whatsoever. There was no unemployment for migrants competing with natives. So when we look at those restrictions, it's important to say, well, maybe the underlying motivation is economics, but the evidence is not there, so maybe there's no real need to think about these restrictions in that way. So I think it's important to focus on evidence-based policy. On the contrary, actually, migrants really benefit economies. The best example in the region is a country that since the early 1900s received migrants from all over the world and integrated them into society and became the richest country in the region. The name of the country is Venezuela in the 1970s. So I think that it's really important for countries who are dealing with this crisis, and I think some of the countries, like I can talk about Colombia because the one I know very well, the authorities are aware of the fact that this crisis could really become an opportunity for their own economic development, and we can discuss more of that in the Q&A. There actually is some evidence that we're working on with some co-authors showing that that's also the case for Colombia. Venezuelans so far have not negatively impacted labor markets in Colombia. It's important to realize, I don't know if we have any World Bank colleagues here, but it's important to realize that there are two things happening at the same time which might give the impression that the economics of the places receiving migrants are being depressed. There was a World Bank report looking at the migration in Colombia, who they claim that migration has increased unemployment, has increased poverty, and so on. But there's something else happening at the same time that migrants are flowing rapidly into Colombia, which is that the main commercial partner of Colombia, particularly the cities and the towns in the border, died. Venezuela was the main commercial partner, of course, of cities like Cucuta, Maicao, et cetera. And when the economy in Venezuela collapsed, that of course has a huge effect on the economics of those cities and towns that are, by the way, also receiving a lot of migrants. So it's very hard to disentangle those two effects, and we have to keep that in mind. Now, there is a possibility that migration flows could have negative impacts on labor markets, particularly in the region where informality is very big, where the type of migrants that are coming in the past couple of years are more fundamental workers who often have like a high school degree or a little bit more, even though they're slightly, on average, more educated and younger than the local labor forces, based on the data. But there could be a temporary negative effect on labor markets. But that temporary labor market effect happens as long as the capital that is in that town, I'm talking about like economics 101, but I'll get to the intuition, as long as there's no replenishment of capital, those wages could be depressed. What do I mean by replenishment of capital? Well, if you have a factory with 10 machines and you have 10 workers, that factory could be working fine. But then suddenly you have 100 more workers coming to that factory. Well, of course, 110 workers with 10 machines is not going to be as productive, right? So the reaction is, well, let's just increase the number of machines, right? That takes time because that's capital. You need to get a loan from the bank. You need to do a lot of things. That's why, in particular, the funds that the IOM and UNHCR are trying to raise are so important for this crisis. Not only because of humanitarian aid, which is crucial, of course, but also to be able to allow the full integration and productive integration of these migrants into the local economies. Because the idea of these funds is not only, again, to give humanitarian aid, but also to create infrastructure, to create schools, to create hospitals, to give credit to the private sector so that they can expand and employ more of these migrants. And these fundings will go not only, of course, to the migrants themselves, but the receiving communities will benefit from it in the medium to long term. So there is a huge, what I'm trying to say maybe with all these explanations is that there is a huge potential for economic development for these migrants when they arrive, if the right policies are put in place and if there's enough funding, which unfortunately is the big piece that we're missing. Just to give some idea, since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, the international community has provided $33 billion cumulative to assist the Syrian refugees, both inside and outside of Syria. The case for the Venezuelan refugees since the beginning of the conflict is being generous, about less than 400 million. So if you just compare the numbers, I know it's not the best comparison, but so far the Syrian refugee crisis has been at a pace of $5,000 per refugee, whereas the Venezuelan refugee crisis has been at a pace of less than $100 per refugee. So there's a huge challenge there to get help from the international community that is not only going to help in terms of humanitarian aid, but also in terms of making this an opportunity of growth and economic development for the region.
Great. Christian, thank you so much for joining us from Bogota. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me as well?
We can hear you perfectly. So Matt, how about you and I step aside? Y damos la palabra a Christian. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you also for this opportunity to speak. I'm sitting in Bogota, and I'm representing the Norwegian Refugee Council. I think I were able to hear most of what you've said. The other colleagues that talked already, so I will try not to repeat what's already been said. I think one of the important things that we would like to highlight is the acuteness of those people fleeing now. So we are seeing that, and this is what we have been seeing throughout the years, is that people are gradually becoming more vulnerable, and people that are leaving Venezuela, are arriving to Colombia, or continuing to Ecuador and Peru, or fleeing across the border to Brazil, are people that have increasingly more needs. So when UNHCR also highlights the fact that this is underfunded, this is a crisis, something that also NRC have highlighted. It's on the top 10 list of underfunded crises in the world at this moment. And we really see the need of scaling up the response, the humanitarian response, not only because this is a permanent flow of people, because the people that are coming, are crossing the borders now, have increased needs. People that have been deprived from clean water, proper nutrition for years, many times. So I think that's a really important aspect to understand, and the sort of gradual deterioration of the situation of people. So the same response that we had a month ago is not appropriate to the situation as it evolves, and we really need to scale up. And we still have, I think, big challenges in terms of doing that. I would also like to say that considering that more Venezuelans arrive in Latin America, one of the most crucial challenges they face is obtaining some sort of status, the regulatory status, which can allow them to integrate, which was just mentioned. How can these people integrate locally to the economies? And clearly the biggest barrier, though there exists in a number of different ways to obtain a visa, to obtain some kind of legal status, they are temporary. And there are quite a few barriers also taken into account. They extremely vulnerable many times coming and have difficulty just accessing these status, legal status, and of course much bigger challenges when accessing any kind of services, and particularly income of any sort. And we also have in Colombia, particularly the issue of newborn children who are at risk of statelessness, which is clearly on the agenda, but it's still happening, and it's not clear how. There is now probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of children that are in the risk of statelessness. So I think we have a number of challenges, and as months goes by, the number of people facing it is increasing. You already mentioned that by the end of the year we could have 5 million Venezuelans at least in the region and where Colombia is the most affected country, or the country with the biggest number of Venezuelans, where you have probably, well, registered now, or 1.3 million, but was probably much closer to 3 million, and even yeah. Another aspect that we would like to highlight is peace development. The fragility of states, so far generous response. I think I've highlighted this. It's something that we are rightly being highlighted as something positive. I think it's also important to understand that there have been open borders, and the generous response. There is no way that they, that effectively close the border. So I think also most states, particularly Colombia, are faced with no options but keep borders open. So it's important for us now that we see also some actions being taken to try to restrict the formal flow of people, where people can flow across the legal border crossing many times with any documentation, but are still nevertheless allowed to flow. And when you see Peru and Ecuador implementing restrictions, there is a chain reaction which is really dangerous, and because this flow is impossible to stop. That's what we believe. If those people are not allowed to cross formal border crossing, they will cross anyway informal border crossing. And this is a region where Colombia particularly is still affected by the armed conflict. So most non-formal border crossing, which there are hundreds of, are controlled by illegal armed actors. So not allowing them to cross, and that is also the fact when people cross from Colombia to Ecuador. So not allowed to cross border crossing, people will be forced to engage with traffickers. Those are already happening to quite a, but most people cross on the formal. And this will then, people will face with really serious protection issues, which a number of people are already, of course, facing. We highlight the fact that people are fleeing from Venezuela into Colombia, which is a country still in armed conflict. We have now registered people that have been internally displaced after fleeing, Venezuelans that arrived to Colombia and have had to face violence in Colombia, which then again have forced them to flee inside Venezuela, inside Colombia, and in some instances to continue their travel against their wishes to other countries in the region. So that also, and we would like to highlight that really sort of shows you some of the complexity that we are faced with. Also, the extremely desperate situation that make people go to an area at armed conflict. Clearly, we're also seeing now clear traces that the arrival of Venezuelans in Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador is overwhelming the local capacity to respond. And with stretched resources and increasing number of arrivals, the risks of discrimination and xenophobia is increasing. So it's again extremely important for the international community to step up their support, to support those local networks that have been extremely generous but are being overwhelmed. And this non-stop flow of people are really putting that low capacity, willingness to test. So I think that is the key thing. I think those are the initial issues that I would like to highlight and looking forward to the discussion.
Question, thanks very much. Perhaps we can move the chairs a little bit. I'm not sure if that's going to affect the video capacity here, but if we can move our chairs a little bit to the side and create a space so that you're seen permanently during this question and answer. I'd like to lead off the questions before turning it over to the audience which I'm sure has a lot to say about this subject. Matt, I think everybody is aware of the dimensions of the crisis, the increasing dimensions, and the number of ways that that communities and governments are being overwhelmed. The response has been 23% just in the year of 2019. Matt, you mentioned this kind of saturation of the world with these global crises, Rohingya, Syrians, Houthi in Yemen. I mean, what is the possibility that the international community, meaning, I guess, not just the United States, which has provided, 3/4 of the assistance to date, but the possibility that Europe, which is overwhelmed with its own crisis of migration from the Middle East and North Africa, I mean, how do you create the incentive or the interest beyond the Western Hemisphere for assisting countries of the region to absorb and deal with this flow?
Well, that is probably one of the largest challenges we have. I mean, the response that we have, and again, there are numerous responses. There are bilateral programs, for example, that the United States provides to various countries like Colombia and so on. But our plan, the 2019 RMRP, the Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan, is a $738 million plan targeting 2.2 million Venezuelans and 580,000 host community individuals as well, as Danny spoke about, across 16 countries and partners. It is, as I said, with all the other challenges, particularly the further you get from a crisis, the harder sometimes it is to raise attention, awareness, and resources. Part of that answer may be, there are a lot of historic ties, obviously, between South America, in particular Venezuela, with Europe. And if you just look at some of the asylum claims, and this is just one of the forms of protection that Venezuelans can find. The largest set of claims, of course, is in Peru, followed by Brazil. Third is the United States, with some 86,000 asylum claims here. But the fourth country is Spain. And you're finding an increasing number of Venezuelans returning to their roots in Europe. And I think that's starting to generate understanding, knowledge, concerns. But, you have the dual crises of an expansion of the amount of refugees and forcibly displaced. We're up to 70 million worldwide now. Coupled with a lot of retrenchment happening, whether it's in Europe, the United States, a lot more, I don't want to say isolationism, but a bit more of withdrawal. You look at even the difficulty in foreign aid budgets, the debates that are going on in Europe about 7-year plans of funding and so on. So it's a challenge. I'm lucky that for my remit at UNHCR, I target the United States, and the United States is our largest and most generous political and financial supporter, particularly when it comes to the Venezuela crisis.
Christian, could I ask you that question? I mean, being a Norwegian organization, the Nordic countries have, and Norway in particular, have reputations for being extremely generous on humanitarian issues. In the case of Colombia, European countries have also been big donors to the peace process. So I guess the question is, how do you motivate donations of scale from the European community, which, according to the last numbers that I saw, had provided something like 5% of the assistance that's been given to date? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that is a challenge. We are coming from a period of time of you are pointing rightly to the fact that Norway, for example, has been supporting the peace process, but that most of Europe has been gradually leaving Latin America, as most countries are middle-income, high middle-income country in the case of Colombia, and are focusing their development funding and also humanitarian response. This is not only a challenge that we are seeing for the Venezuela crisis, we're also finding that same challenge, and even worse, for Central America. That it's almost impossible to get any humanitarian funding from Europe and also including US to respond to the Central American migrant and refugee crisis. So this is something I think we're seeing generically in the region. And I think we have a big task as those on the ground that are seeing this very dangerous deterioration of the situation. You can see that just in the last few months, you see how people, even in the upper scale areas of the cities in Latin America, are increasing just by walking down the street. I think there is a real need of being able to communicate that. Us, UNHCR, other humanitarian actors, we really need also to be able to better communicate. Because this is, if you come here, it has up until now been largely invisible. This has happened far away, and people are relatively have been to sort of eating. It's not easy to but the real risk of and the regional destabilization of not being able to assist people at extreme need and assist states is so I think it is on both sides. It's also we that are already there, and we need also states to be and Europe in particular to which also rightly I think ECHO, the humanitarian donor of the European Union, has increased dramatic and has been one of the humanitarian actors really putting the situation of Venezuela on the agenda, and is now probably, the numbers are not clear, the biggest donor for humanitarian response inside Venezuela. So the numbers are, I would say, are slightly more complex as well, but it is clear that to avoid a much bigger catastrophe, we need now to scale up, and we need to get that message much more effectively to those main donors and others.
Your last, whoops, that one's not on. Let's try this. Is this on? Yeah. Kristen, your last comment about European donations through ECHO inside Venezuela. My question is, what possibilities are there through UN agencies, through nonprofits, to scale up the humanitarian response inside Venezuela to perhaps relieve some of the suffering that is prompting people to migrate? Obviously, it's not going to deal with the questions of violence or political repression or whatever, but basic necessities, food, water, whatever. What is the, I know the UN has been doing that very quietly, but what are the possibilities for making that a much more significant program within Venezuela itself?
It has been highly complex, as you know, but there is some movement, I think. Yeah, and just this week or last week, the humanitarian response plan for Venezuela has been launched by the UN. But up until now, it's been very difficult to set up operations and to in fact do operation inside Venezuela due to the political situation. But we have seen some movement, and of course for NRC that is one of our priority, to be able to assist people where they are and those people that are in need inside Venezuela. That is one of the things that's extremely important for us as a humanitarian actor, that we are able to do a neutral, independent, and based on need assistance there, and that the politics of this, which is extremely complex, are left out, and that those who are engaged in the political dialogues also can address that particular area, that there is allowed a humanitarian space, which does exist. The Venezuelan government has allowed NRC and other organizations, UNHCR, to work there, and to also during the last months to slightly expand our operations there. But then we really need to protect that humanitarian action is neutral, is independent, and we need to avoid, for example, the kind of actions that happened earlier this year when politics and humanitarian aid was clearly mixed together.
Sure. Danny.
I think that the idea of scaling up humanitarian aid in Venezuela, it's a good one in theory. I think in practice, it's near impossible in order to stop this. And I'm actually going to throw some numbers because I've done a little bit of work on this. The projections that you mentioned at the beginning of our talk on the number of Venezuelan migrants that we could expect seeing in the next few years is based out of a very simplistic but mathematical model on measuring something that is really sad but very simple. With the income that is coming through to Venezuela, mostly because most of it comes from oil production, how many calories can you buy to feed the people in Venezuela, those who need, those who would need humanitarian assistance? Just to throw some numbers that you might be aware, but 9 out of 10 Venezuelans are living in extreme poverty. The minimum salary, which is the salary of the majority of the population, is not enough to buy. I think the number was, it keeps changing, of course, with hyperinflation, but it's about 200 calories of food per month, if I'm not mistaken. So Venezuela is increasingly relying on remittances, which are, of course, flowing in. But in order to close this gap between the amount of money that, if the government, which is a huge if the government, or the regime, I should say, were to allocate all of the production of oil income to humanitarian programs, which is of course a very unrealistic assumption, but if they were to do that, you still have a gap of billions of dollars in order to cover the minimum calories that a person would need to survive. That difference is actually what's the base for our projection, like how many people can, with the current economic situation, with the amount of oil that is being produced that has been going down and down and down, the price of oil and the remittances, how many people can be fitted with this amount of money. And the ones that cannot is actually the projection of people that we assume. It's kind of a simplistic model, but I guess it's good enough to start a conversation, but that's the number of people that we assume could leave. But by that saying, like, I think that Venezuela is gonna need a lot of humanitarian aid to stop the catastrophe. At this point, we're talking about billions of dollars. And I think that I agree. I mean, we have to try hard to separate politics, but it's very complicated. And with this regime, it's gonna be impossible to run a program like that. That's why the reconstruction of Venezuela will start by knocking the door of the IMF for amounts that are probably about $50 billion. So we're talking about huge numbers in order to stop the humanitarian catastrophe in Venezuela, maybe as large as the ones that the countries who are receiving migrants would need. So.
David, you want to comment?
Yes, I think one of the problems that we have had with this crisis is that it has not been put in a global context. This, for many, has been interpreted as a regional or even a sub-regional crisis. So this is a problem in South America, or this is a problem of 3 or 4 countries. This is a problem of Colombia or Chile or Peru or Ecuador or Brazil, or it's a problem of the Caribbean. And what we want, when we release this report and we talk about to create a regional consensus, but it's also to put this crisis in the global context. As I said at the beginning, this is the biggest migration and refugee crisis in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, and as we speak, is the second largest in the world after Syria, that has been in a war for more than 8 years. And if this crisis continues in Venezuela, we'll see in the near future, when I say the near future, it will be a year, more Venezuelan refugees than Syrian refugees. So we need to put this in a global context, and definitely the international community, and I am Venezuelan, and I'm very grateful on the efforts that so many countries have made to not only to receive Venezuelans in Latin America and the Caribbean, but the countries that have donated money for these receiving countries, but unfortunately, it's not enough. And the biggest challenges that we have found, and I have the privilege during the last 100 days, I have been to Colombia 3 times, I have been to Peru, I have been to Ecuador, to Aruba, to Curacao. Last year I went to Brazil, I have been to Mexico. The biggest challenges that we have found is where the money needs to go first, to the documents of Venezuelans. At least half of the Venezuelans that have fled the country are in irregular status or soon to be in regular status. So we need to resolve that situation, and that is why we're proposing to give them refugee status. Second challenges that we have found, healthcare. At least 1.5 million Venezuelans that have fled suffer from malnutrition. And there are so many other cases of diphtheria, malaria, HIV. 7 out of 10 women that are giving birth in the border of Colombia, Venezuela, Norte de Santander are Venezuelans. 6 out of 10 women that are giving birth in Boavista in Brazil are Venezuelans. So the healthcare, which costs a lot of money, is another challenge. Third, security, which I don't know it because maybe that was my priority when I was a mayor, where I'm quite concerned about the situation in the border between Venezuela and Colombia, where you have checkpoints that have been installed by the ELN and by the colectivos, the urban guerrilla or rural guerrilla in Venezuela, where basically they're extortioning every Venezuela that use the trochas, the illegal path, what we call trochas in Spanish. In Spanish, every Venezuelan that goes out or go in, they have to pay at least $1. I mean, the exception is to find someone that has taken the trocha and say, I have not paid anything. At least $1. So if 1/3 of Venezuelans go through the trochas, which is very conservative to say this after February 23rd, if 1/3 of Venezuelans goes through the trochas and they pay at least $1, which was also very conservative number, which is the 30% minimum salary. I mean, these colectivos and ELN, just for extortion, they're doing $10,000 daily in a work that is Monday to Monday. So that's $300,000 monthly just for extortion. And of course, you're having irregular groups that are recruiting Venezuelans that are cheaper than recruiting Colombians, that they are taking the opportunity for a humanitarian crisis. So they take someone under age of 18 and those irregular groups tell to those teenagers, I'll give you food, I'll give you medicine, but please come to this group, take an arm, take a weapon, become a part of the illegal activities, and also the proliferation of human trafficking or sexual exploitation. I have not seen a report recently about this, but if I had to bet on modern slavery, Venezuela, I'm sure it will be on the first on the region, very sure, unfortunately. So even though I agree with Danny about the decrease of the oil income and how, unfortunately, with the region that Venezuela has the biggest reserve oil in the world, but people are just starving. They're replacing oil, and the regime is replacing the oil income through the criminal economy, through drug trafficking, through illegal mining, through smuggling. So, I mean, I was talking with the Colombian authorities just a few weeks ago. The criminal economy is estimated that makes $500 billion worldwide every year, and 40% is in Latin America. So we're talking more than $200 billion of criminal economy in Latin America. How much that money is now generated in Venezuela? So that's the challenges, of course, of the integration of the Venezuelans that have fled to formal work and children to education. So the region has made a huge effort receiving millions of Venezuelans, something that we never saw that maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But with due respect, migration restrictions are not the solution. It will get the situation even worse, and we'll see so many people stuck in Colombia or so many people stuck in other countries. So in Quito, I brought this, Cynthia. We had this very interesting tarjeta de movilidad regional that it was also a proposal at the report, and the UNHCR and the IOM is working on it. This will be huge if we're able to do it. It was great, and last week on the Quito meeting that was Buenos Aires chapter, we discussed this. This is just an example, of course, it's not official, that what we're discussing now is that at least 2 million Venezuelans that, as I said earlier, are irregular or soon to be regular, could have this, and with this access to healthcare, to education, who apply for a job and also have the freedom to move, at least in the region. I hope this could be something that's not an idea, it's not an example, it could be official. That will be a great example for the world on integration. That is why we're asking of a regional consensus here. And also something important, and finish on this. The President Guaido had a decree number 6 to valid the passports that expired. It gives a valid of 5 years since the date of the expiration. This could sound something small, but it's not as small. It's huge. It's huge because to renew a passport now in Venezuela, or to get a new passport in Venezuela right now, well, you have to pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. You have to become part of that illegal activities, unfortunately, to get a passport. It's so expensive because of the network of extortion and corruption. So if the region, especially if you have 56 countries beyond the region that recognize President Guaido as head of state of Venezuela, accept that decreto that of the expired passports, I think that also will help on the migration, on the Venezuelan migrants and refugees to not only to be protected, but be integrated. This is very tough for Venezuelans. As Danny, I'm also come from a family of migrants, and to see now Venezuelans fleeing. I mean, after this conference ends, it's a 2 hours conference, 400 Venezuelans will have fled the country because 200 Venezuelans are fleeing every hour. So for Venezuelans, this is very tough, but at the same time, I think it represents huge and important opportunity for Latin American and Caribbean to protect and integrate millions that want to become entrepreneurs, that want to work, that want to study, that could have a positive impact on those societies. And if we restore democracy soon in Venezuela, hopefully the migration will decrease, and then many at least will have the opportunity to decide if they want to go back.
Okay, I think it's time to turn to you for your questions and comments. Please wait for the microphone, and please do us the courtesy of introducing yourself. Tell us where you come from. Let's start back here. We'll take a couple questions together and then come back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Eric Neri. I'm in the Center for Democracy and Development in the Americas. And I have a two-piece question, which is how important is to have background information on the migrants and the profile of the migrants from Venezuela to the countries on the region to sort of have an understanding of their backgrounds, to integrate themselves into the labor force, et cetera, et cetera. And the second question is sort of the incentive of the private sector within the countries of South America who are integrating these migrants and sort of to incentivize their efforts to, keep the workforce from integrating Venezuelans and sort of revamping their economies with and taking the advantage of the migrants to get into these countries.
Okay, we have another hand here up front.
Hi, my name is Janina Romero, and I work with the working group for the OAS. So I am a little bit concerned with the recruiting of Venezuelan by different guerrillas, and knowing that Colombia right now has, is going through the peace process, but it's still a very weak process. How could that affect the peace process going on in Colombia, and what could be the risk of a reactivation of the guerrillas in Colombia? Could we be seeing then also Colombians fleeing through Latin America and maybe making this worse for the region?
Okay, why don't we take those two questions? Who would like to start? Danny.
I can say something. Thank you, Eric. The first question on the importance of the characteristics is, the more data you have, the more information is always welcomed. There are ways, I think, in which governments can create policies to foster integration. So I'm mixing your two questions. At the end, the market is the one who's going to decide, right, who's getting what job and so on. But there are there's a lot of space to do with that information to maybe do more informed policy. One of the things, I can talk more about Colombia because that's where I've gotten access to data and I've worked a little bit much closely with the government. I think that there's a big enigma, for instance, that I don't know if you know this, but if there's one thing that you would remember from everything I said, it should be the next sentence, which is Colombia, at the end of 2018, they regularized 470,000 Venezuelans who were in their territory and entered through irregular entry points. That's huge. 500,000 people, from one day to another, Colombia decided we're gonna give to almost 500,000 people who enter the country irregularly, illegally, however you wanna call it, their right to work, their right to go to school, their right to get education, and so on. I don't think any other country in the world has done it, except I think for Uganda, who has done something similar. In parentheses, that tells you a lot of the migration policies or the rhetoric migration policies in the US that everybody's so scared about. Anyway, Colombia is there, it didn't collapse, it's still doing actually very well. So why am I saying this? Because that process, as positive as it was, it created actually a big enigma, because out of these 470,000 people who are given the right to regularize, to get the what is called the PEP, el Permiso Especial de Permanencia, one of the visas that the Colombian government created, about 60% actually went and got the visa. Why the other 40% didn't do it, that's, to me as an economist, at least, is a big enigma, right? I mean, one possibility is some of them left, other possibilities that some of them are already working in the informal markets, which are like a huge part of the Colombian labor market. They could go from 40 to 60 or even more %. Even in that case, it still doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because you can still work in the informal market and get your visa, right? But one thing that I've been looking at with the data is that one of the aspects that explain who got it and who didn't is people who had family in Colombia. It's kind of the only thing that explains. So all this to say that there are ways to exploit the data and the demographic characteristics to perhaps do better policy, in sense of if you are providing credits to the private sector, which Colombia is doing, by the way, $220 million of credits Colombia is giving to private sector in the most inflicted regions, which is twice as much as the money I think that has been given by some of the international community actors. If you wanna, perhaps try to think what are the sectors that are more likely to expand with the inflow of Venezuela, it's good to know, like, the ones who are working in the formal market, where are they doing it, right? So there are some decisions that could perhaps be informed by that, but at the end of the story, of course, is the market. I think I'm gonna leave it at that.
Anybody else?
Maybe.
Go ahead, sure, go ahead.
Yes. Maybe also adding a little bit to the previous, why didn't more people register? I think this is, of course, we don't have any representative statistics to this, but one of the things that we see is that there is quite an important level of fear, because Colombia is, and many, particularly in the border areas, you still armed conflict. So the whole issue of registering also bring forward, like, the fear of being identified in Colombia. So I think that's an element. I don't think that is an element of public policy, but it's clearly an element that could explain, at least to some degree, why more people haven't registered. And that brings me to maybe another aspect in a study that NRC did with a relatively low number of people participating, but which gives us an indication also there's only about 50% of people that are having income bringing activities. So you have it in Colombia, a large number of people that are not able to find nor formal or informal work of those who have already arrived, and more than 60% could be out of school, according to those. So though there are registered the possibility of legally having access to a visa, there are other barriers that don't allow people to access services still. So, and that is also what we find many times when we work with the displaced in Colombia. Now focusing mainly on Colombia, I think you can find different situations in other countries. That and internally displaced in Colombia have a similar barriers when it comes to accessing. And internally displaced have a ID, but still cannot access health services, etc. And many times are out of school. And that is what we have been finding in a city like Bogota. When we go to one of the most marginalized neighborhoods, we find 50-50 of people recently displaced and people that are of Venezuelan origin that are out of school. So I think this at least can give you some idea. And when you that brings me to the other question: if there is the peace process in Colombia, I would say that the peace process in Colombia is facing many problems, largely because the lack of implementation by Colombia, and not as much as the impact of the Venezuelan crisis. However, this lack of implementation and the Venezuela crisis and the very unstable situation on the border is clearly making the conflict in Colombia more volatile. And that is generating risk for Colombia. So we see rising numbers of displaced, and we see also rising number of people fleeing to Ecuador and to Panama, which is where I can speak from. It's not a dramatic increase, but it's a continuation of what we have seen, with a slight increase this year, where we see an increasing number of Colombians. They are not comparable in any way, the enormous flow of Venezuelans, but these are clearly an indication of a concerning trend, and where we are finding people that are not finding protection in Colombia.
Other questions, comments? All the way there in the back. Is this on? It's on. You guys keep that one up.
Hello, my name is Carlos Rodriguez. I'm from Venezuela, and we have been talking about how Venezuela has a need for humanitarian aid. However, in some countries in Africa and especially in Asia, we have seen that some humanitarian aid programs have not been really efficient with helping the problem, and has created another problem, which is some local economies have problem with developing their products and their companies. So do you think that might be the case with Venezuela if we spend a lot on humanitarian aid instead of trying to fix the economy? Thank you.
Yeah, really.
That's a great question. Without any evidence whatsoever, just my instinct, which is not, which I have to say, but it's not a good way to answer a question, is that the answer is no. I mean, I think it's a bit different. I think that you're very right that there's a long history of aid, humanitarian aid or aid in general, has not been the panacea of development as we always thought, or as it was like envisioned perhaps in the 50s and the 60s. I think that the case of Venezuela is a bit different. I think Venezuela has huge potential to, again, become a rich country, or it's going to take a lot of time. But I think that the aid that we're talking for Venezuela is really to stop the bleeding at this moment. People have, 75% of Venezuelans have lost 20 pounds of weight. Again, the numbers of poverty are 90%. The infant mortality, which is it's perhaps a good proxy of the health situation as a whole, has increased dramatically. So I think that there's a need to stop that bleeding, but at the same time, there's the need to restart the engine of the economy. The engine of the economy now is dead in Venezuela, not because the capabilities aren't there, but because the regime has basically did everything that any Econ 101 textbook will tell you not to do. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. So we arrived to a situation in which there's no private sector because of huge regulations on private sector, on prices, on et cetera, et cetera. We arrived to a situation in which there's no food because all the boom of oil that happened in the 2000s was spent on social programs, part of it, and that's why you did see some reduction of poverty in Venezuela, but it was a fake reduction of poverty because once that flow went down, again, poverty came back. The reason being that they not only spend all the money, but they indebted themselves. Venezuela has now a debt that is estimated about $150 billion, which is part of the legacy of Chavez and Maduro, which, I mean, the transition government will comply and will repay, but it will need to do some restructuring. So all this to say that I think that there is potential in Venezuela to revive the economy if we start by, bringing back the mechanisms of the very basic market economy that Venezuela was and working. There are huge challenges in terms of society and inequality and poverty that are going to be there, but I think that it's a bit of a different story than other countries in other continents that we've seen. It's not going to be easy. Just to finalize with another piece of data, the GDP of Venezuela has fallen by about 50% in 4 or 5 years. When you think of the 2008 recession, that's peanuts compared to what's happening to Venezuela. If you think of the 1929 crisis, that's peanuts compared to what happened in Venezuela. So there has been a real destruction of the economy, of all the production apparatus. So it's going to be very hard, and that's why we're going to need the IMF, the international community, to come and help rebuild the country. And the migrants are going to be key in reconstructing Venezuela. But I think that there's potential, and even if the risk of getting into this vicious cycle of aid stopping Venezuela from going forward, I think, are low.
Do we have others in the back?
We can hear you.
Perfect. My name is Laura Rodriguez. I'm an MA candidate at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. My question is, you are calling, the report from the OAS is calling to give Venezuelan refugees refugee status based on the Cartagena Declaration. And I'm wondering, this is not the first time that has been applied, as you will know from Ecuador's experience in 2008, 2009 with the extended registry. I'm wondering, how is this going to be different if there is any willingness from countries in the region to make this a different experience? Thank you.
Our willingness, not that much. But at least we need to start having that discussion. And the OAS probably is one of the best political forum to have it. There are some countries that are considering implement Cartagena. For example, Brazil is one of them, and that was said at the Quito meeting last week. Also, by the matter of facts, Mexico is kind of doing it through the Visa Humanitarian, the Comar. So after a year, you have the Visa Humanitarian, you can apply for a permanent residence. There are other governments that are not convinced to implement a Cartagena Declaration. With this report, where we want to is to start having that discussion and to create a regional consensus. If we are not able to implement literally Cartagena Declaration at least a legal instrument, a regional legal instrument, as close as possible to Cartagena Declaration that guarantee attention, protection, and integration of the Venezuelan migrants and refugees. So, for example, Secretary General of the OAS already has made public that is important to implement Cartagena Declaration. Of course, the UNHCR and the IOM already have said it. And as I said, there are some governments like the Brazil or Mexico that are, Mexico, in my opinion, is doing it already through their own way. Brazil is considering. So we need to start having that discussion. So that's one of the goals that we wanted to have with this report. Yeah.
Others?
Can I add something very
Please.
quickly, as also with the hat of somebody who was part of the in the report? I think that one of the key messages of the refugee status is not only about protection for the refugees themselves, it's also and I like to, even at the risk of being very redundant, but I like to say this is in the best benefit of the countries. For many reasons, but the one that is, I think, the most important is the temporary versus the permanent status. Right now, the countries have been very generous mostly with temporary statuses. So in Colombia, for instance, the PEP visa, which is the one that has been given to most Venezuelans, is a 2-year visa, renewable, but it's a 2-year visa. So it has a finite horizon. Similar thing in other countries. Once you to have a finite horizon in your, think about all of you, I don't know how many are you, I'm guessing there are many immigrants like me in the room, but if you have a finite horizon on how long can you stay in a country without certainty if you're gonna be still, to be able to stay more, you're less likely to invest in yourself, you're less likely to invest in your kids, and an employer is less likely to invest in you because you might have to leave in a year or two, right? So if we are thinking of a way to do a pragmatic solution that it's already in the legislation of all the countries, right? It's the only status that it's valid in all the countries with the same rights and the same protections. And at the same time, it's the one that is going to give the best possibility of integration and increase of productivity and economic growth, is this one, because it provides this permanent horizon that I think is really important.
I see a finger right here, yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Elena Sauders. I work at ADRA International, and I am the person responsible for our programming dealing with the Venezuelan crisis in Colombia and in Brazil. My question would have to do with funding, the funding that we are, I think, all calling for in order to properly respond to the crisis in the region. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, we've discussed, especially in the context of Colombia, that there are needs that even the host communities have that haven't been addressed. So I'm wondering how you would advise that donors and the implementing partners actually include these people into programming. Should it be done through different agency funding streams? Should every single program that seeks to address the issues of Venezuelan migrants also have portions of it dedicated specifically for the needs of the host communities? And how can the NGO community be a part of that decision-making process with the donors and the people who advise donors on how to strategize? Thank you.
Great. Obviously, a very key question. How do you, if you're worried about containing xenophobia and a backlash, I mean, perhaps one of the best ways to guarantee that that will occur is to privilege one group of people over another. So I'm going to actually ask Christian to answer that question. I hope you heard it. It has to do with including the, yeah, go ahead. And then Matt also, if the UNHCR has some perspective on that. Go ahead.
I'll maybe take the opportunity to add one aspect to the previous also before we move into the previous issue with the Cartagena Declaration and the fact that most have not have permanent status. I think what we found is that now most people are not planning to return. The lack of any permanent status is a really important policy issue. We are finding actually similar numbers both in Ecuador and Peru, in Brazil and Colombia, where almost more than 70% have no plans to. So in the short, medium term, people are planning to integrate, people are planning to stay. But public policy really needs to be addressed, and the permanence of legal status is important. And of course, there one possibility is practice. Then moving into the other issue of how to address the most people are extremely vulnerable and end up in very vulnerable neighborhoods where we always find a big variety of needs. I think what we need to do is scale up much more operational coordination. Still, coordination mechanisms at the ground are very weak, we would say. This is a very large-scale issue. We find Venezuela is now spread over an enormously big area. But we should at least, in the border areas, where you have an important concentration, and some of this, where you have finding the most scale up on-the-ground coordination. And one crucial element of that is needs assessment. So needs assessment, which we are not there need very few actually. We have done one of the few. Then you would also have to address the host community's needs, and then you will start to have to be integrated programming. But of course, with the kind of funding we have now, which is very slow moving, and we are only able to address the most critical needs, and doing much larger scale, moving into development, reintegration, and local economical integration. That is what's been needed scale up. And then we need development funding, World Bank funding, all kinds of sources of funding. While what we have access to now is largely 40 to 50% of the land funding is sponsored. This local integration is more flexible able to address that.
Okay, Christian, I'm going to ask you to repeat that last thing that you said because the connection is not the best, and a good portion of what you were saying was dropping out when you were talking about the funding, and if you could just repeat the last sentence or two, thanks.
Yeah, try, and then so as I simply a large portion of fund.
It's not working. Yeah. It's not working. I might actually, at the risk of making this a more boring presentation, perhaps ask you to turn off your camera, and that way maybe the sound will come through better. Yeah, okay. Try speaking some and see if that makes it better. Nope, I think... Yeah, really, we need more money for infrastructure. There you go. Yeah, suboptimal. Okay. Well, we'll try to be in touch via email. This is perhaps an unfair question because none of the panelists is from the World Bank or the IDB, but is there anyone who is in a position to describe what the major IFIs that have a footprint in the region are doing, not just in terms of loans that have to be repaid by the host countries, but also in terms of grants? Danny, you want to take that, or?
Yeah, why don't I try and take two of them, last on the coordination. The first, on the coordination issue, that's one of the key concepts of the platform. There are 95 partners. You're looking at multilateral, international, regional, and national coordination for the platforms. Of course, if there were more resources, you could do a lot more. A key part of that is, in fact, support for host communities. Because particularly in the case, and almost exclusively in this case, Migrants and refugees are not in camps. They are throughout, just like it is growing in the world. 58% of refugees around the world don't live in camps. They're in urban areas and surrounding neighborhoods. So the host community support is extremely important, of course, for acceptance, but also because, frankly, they're in the host communities. And that's an important pillar, actually, in the regional response for socio and economic integration. I think what you're seeing here in particular is, again, as we're seeing in many other crises around the world, this nexus of change or nexus of humanitarian into development. So ensuring that refugees and migrants are included in national development plans, which also include the host communities. That kind of coordination and that kind of support, looking, unfortunately, as crises like this become more protracted, it really does become less of a humanitarian and more of a development situation. The other thing that really would help with coordination on the ground and reaching priorities is for donors to provide as much unearmarked money as possible. Some of the major donors are very generous that way, allowing those in the field to make those decisions with local communities where things are needed. What's sometimes challenging is you'll have a donor, whether it's a country or a foundation or others, who want to work on one specific little project. It's not necessarily sustainable, and it may not be the actual need of that community. So that's what we are striving to do. In terms of engagement of the IFIs, of international financial institutions, the regional platform does include the World Bank, which has been providing economic technical support, some economic impact studies. There was one done in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador. The Global Concessional Financing Facility, which I believe is also available. The Inter-American Development Bank is putting together a special fund, $100 million, for the response to Venezuelan outflows. One of the issues, because we have a partnership, UNHCR, a strong partnership with the World Bank, there are the two forms of both grants and loans, but because of the nature of most South American countries fall into that middle income, so they do fall more into the loan side. But again, those loans are tied to host community actions, and we've seen in countries like Lebanon and Jordan, they've actually, where this was first experimented with, they've actually brought a lot of support and a lot of, the Lebanese public school system is far better today because of that World Bank loan, which was prompted by Syrian refugees, but in fact, has really improved all of those locals. We are seeing more and more attention from the international financial institutions towards Venezuela. The one other thing that makes this a very different kind of crisis than we've seen around the world is 4 out of 5 refugee situations, people go to the next country next door, 4 out of 5. So 85% are right there. With Venezuela, you see this movement of people far and far. It's not just to Colombia and Brazil and Guyana, the actual neighbors, but to, obviously, you've got Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, Chile, and the movement through the islands and going north. There are some 26,000 already Venezuelans in Dominican Republic. And as I mentioned, there are many coming to the United States. Venezuela, this half of year in 2019 was the #1 source of asylum claims in the United States, an increasing number of them on the American southern border. So you do see that, which makes it, also brings different challenges, because you can't just concentrate in one or 2 or 3 countries, as in Syria, you've got Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, but here the needs are very diverse across the ways. The needs of a country that's really quite still developing, like Guyana, are much different than the needs of Ecuador.
Matt, I'd like to follow up and push you a little bit on that. Latin America, as several of you have pointed out, has sort of graduated in the world, in the eyes of the in the eyes of the international community in terms of being a beneficiary of concessional aid. Could you expand a little bit on the concessional facility that the World Bank has that has been made available to Colombia or other countries in the region? I know that one of the sort of game changers, in the words of a recent study for the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, was to vastly expand IDA for countries, very, very poor countries in Africa that see a lot of refugee flows. Is that an option for both the World Bank and the IDB to give grants as opposed to actual loans that have to be repaid?
Well, I can't speak for I'm not the expert on the World Bank or for their judgment of when it becomes a loan or a grant for the sizes of the economy and GNP, et cetera. But this clearly, as part of the global compacts that are out there, is clearly one of the avenues, is looking at international financial institutions to help address a lot of the forced displacement, including internally displaced around the world. You know, one of the things that makes a difference on this is that the money comes with with strings, and those strings are, as I pointed out, you know, support for host communities, but they also require a protection note from UNHCR, particularly in countries that may not be as developed or may have as generous international protection regimes as Latin America does with Cartagena. So I mean, there's a strong, in many countries there are strong protection systems versus in some African countries where there aren't. And part of that is these countries make a commitment in receiving the funding to also uphold the kinds of international protections and the kind of protection that refugees need.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two last questions. If, yes, right here. Oriana, next to you, is there a, do we have a mic? I see here on this side of the table, and where else? Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carly Greenfield. I'm from the Migration Policy Institute. And I had some questions, I guess, for you, Matt, about since this is such a diverse amount of flows and we're seeing people go to so many different countries, what are the opportunities at the more local levels? So for cities across the region, since we are seeing more refugees and migrants going to urban areas, to work together to talk about best ideas, what are we seeing at the municipality level, instead of just state conversations, since we do know that there might be maybe more similarities there. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know if that was planted because, of course, with UNHCR, we have an initiative to actually bring cities, particularly cities that are doing a really stand-up job in helping those in need of international protection and refugees and others. I think of even in the region, we have like Sao Paulo. There are some cities here in the United States. I was just in Pittsburgh, which is doing a wonderful job of refugee resettlement and integration. So yes, it is high. There's all kinds of great things that different cities can exchange ideas and the way they are handling things, and that is a major focus of UNHCR, and I think it'll be a big part of our big annual meeting in December. But thanks for putting the plug in.
Okay. Anybody else on that one? And there was one more over here.
Hi, my name is Julia Kipczynska. I'm a student at Columbia University in New York, and I was wondering what are some of the, if something could be spoken about this, what are some of the patterns and trends of the human rights violations that are being reported or spoken about, and how is this information being documented within the refugee and migrant communities?
Okay, well, as I said when we started the conference, one of the determinants that we have found that people are fleeing against their will is the human rights violation. I think the latest and most important document that we have seen recently is the report that was released by the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. There is well documented different type of human rights violations, more than 15,000 illegal detention during the last 5 years, thousands of extrajudicial killings, hundreds of acts of repression and on non-violent protest. Apart from that document, or for example, the OAS released a very important report last year on crimes against humanity. One of the things that has impacted me more when I have visited not only the border with Venezuela, but countries that are far, as Matthew was explaining, like Chile or Argentina, is that the fear that the regime has created in the society, it just has made so many people to flee the country. Just to live in a nation where you wake up and you are afraid of doing anything, because you can be a victim of an extrajudicial killing, or you can be a victim of a huge repression with tear gas or bullets or rubber bullets in a protest, or you could be illegally detained because you only tweeted. So the persecution has been generalized, and when I was illegally removed as a mayor, and I had order arrest, and I had to go 35 days in hiding, I remember so many people of my team saying, "What are you going to tweet?" And I just said, my number has gone up. My number has been, salió mi número en español. My number has just been up, because everyone in Venezuela has a number. It's a matter of time when it will come up. My number came up in 2017. The numbers of many lawmakers has come up during the last month. So many numbers to doctors, nurses, teachers, students have come up. So it doesn't matter what do you do in Venezuela, but if you are against the regime, you have a number. So that's the worst thing that you can feel when you are living, because you know at the end of the day that the number will come up, and you will be in a jail, or you will be in exile, or you have to go hiding, or you will be killed, like it happened with this Capitan Acosta Arevalo, that he was killed after so many tortures. That's a message to whom? To the armed forces. And what happened when you go to the borders of Brazil and Colombia? You already are seeing so many soldiers that have fled, not the ones that fled after February 23rd, because I saw so many soldiers, even before February 23rd, fled the country because they were afraid that they could be illegally detained and they could be tortured. So I don't know if I answered accurately your question, but that's where we're experiencing right now in Venezuela. And as I said, I mean, we have not had a formal war, we have not had a natural catastrophe. So definitely, if soon Venezuelans restore democracy and freedom, I think it will decrease significantly the number of people that are fleeing, and also you create an incentive to people to go back. And I just wanted to add, sorry, about what Nina asked that Christian answered, that I think the peace process in Colombia is in huge risk when you having your neighbor creating basically a sanctuary for those irregular groups to get protection. Unfortunately, Maduro has made of Venezuela one of the safest territory in the world for anyone who wants to do an illegal activity. So the ELN is already in 13 states of Venezuela. By the way, the ELN is not only at the border with Colombia. They have taken a lot of control in the southeast of Venezuela, which is very far from the border with Colombia. We're talking that they are in the border with Brazil, where they're taking control of the minery. So if Venezuela does not collaborate on that, I think the peace process in Colombia is in danger, and I think that this problem is not only affecting Venezuelans, but it's affecting the region.
And with the human rights angle, there's a second angle here, which is common to all crises, including the situation surrounding Venezuela, and that is when refugees, migrants, people on the move become very, very vulnerable. And the human rights abuses to them are great, whether it's sexual exploitation, human trafficking, human exploitation, child protection, all of these. When people like this are on the move and on the run, it's not just perhaps thinking about human rights of where they're coming from or where they're going to, but the route itself is filled with all kinds of challenges and real, think of those as truly as the victims that are facing all of these smuggling, trafficking, and so on.
Great. I think on that sobering note, we're going to end. I'd like to thank Christian in Bogota for everything that he and his team are doing to address this crisis on the ground in Colombia and other countries of the region. Also like to, although the Norwegian Refugee Council is a nonprofit and an NGO, thank the government of Norway for what it's trying to do to bring about a peaceful transition in Venezuela. Thank you, David. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dani, for lending your expertise. This is one of many conversations we'll be having on Venezuela. Thank you again to my staff. Thank you for joining us this morning.